Was the ransom paid to Satan?
But it was paid to Satan.
And this theory of atonement was actually a ransom paid to Satan. So we are not just concocting this out of thin air. This is something which is well received in the Eastern Church, Orthodox Church, even to this day.
Allah says, I'll forgive you. There's no cutting off. There's no, a price has to be paid. People who died before Jesus came, are you now claiming that that price was somehow applied retrospectively to people?
Elijah is in heaven, and Enoch, you know.
Yeah, so where are them guys? So why do they get free pass?
When he underwent that death, then the descent. This is how the reformers started interpreting his descent into Hades. The descent into hell is Jesus is damned for us. No, that's ridiculous. And the descent into hell is the harrowing of hell. This is a complete destruction of all of the idiotic Protestant theology about the atonement.
And we have a very clear, very explicit doctrine. You go and you read book 3 of John Damascus. At the end of book 3, he gives multiple sections explaining this doctrine. He says that what happened in the death of Christ is not a damning of the Son. It's not a damning of the Father. There is a sense in which we speak of a kind of punishment. You can say that the human nature that he assumed did undergo death, and it did undergo a kind of punishment. There's nothing wrong with that. But explicitly what that means, he says, is that the human soul was severed from the human body. But remember, David says, you will not allow your Holy One to undergo or see corruption. So even in the severing of the human soul from the human body, we don't believe that Christ underwent any decay or corruption. But he did will to undergo death in the human nature that he assumed.
Let's listen to what St. John says. Since Christ was without sin, because he had done no iniquity, and he who was that takes away the sin of the world, nor was there deceit found in his mouth, Isaiah 53:9, John 1:29, he was not subject to death, right? He took on the seed of Adam. If he didn't want to, he didn't have to die, even though death had entered in by the sin of Adam. So for our sake, he submitted to death, and he dies, and he offers himself to the Father as a sacrifice. So rather than this being some stupid thing where the Father damns the Son, Christ offers his humanity and this death as an offering to the Father. And again, this is also Trinitarian. He's not being damned. He's offering that human death as an offering. Listen to this. He submits to death and offers himself to the Father as a sacrifice. For we had offended him, and it was necessary for him to take upon himself our redemption, that we might be loosed from the condemnation. For God forbid that the Lord's blood would have been offered to the tyrant. It's not offered to Satan. Right.
Redemption has nothing to do with paying the devil a ransom or trying to satisfy the anger and honor of an angry God, as we see in later developments of theories of salvation.
Wherefore, when death approaches, Satan, death, gulps down the bait of the body. So Satan is here. He thinks he's going to win. He takes Christ into his realm, Hades, right? He thinks, I've got him. He's dying. I've won. I'm going to snatch this prophet, this character, whoever he is. I'm going to take him down to Hades. He's mine. He's going to take him into the realm of Hades and hell. This is a spiritual realm. It's a reality, a place, spiritually speaking. When the wicked die, they go into this realm. They are owned by their master, Satan. But this is a trap, according to St. John Damascus. The body, he says, of Christ is a trap for Satan, because this is not the body of a mere man. This is the body of the Logos. And this body, even though it's undergoing death, is deified. We're going to draw some little power lines around it, right? Electricity power lines going around this body here. Even though it's undergoing death, it's not the body of a mere man. It is pierced by the hook of divinity. So then, having tasted of this sinless and life-giving body, when death takes this into its realm, Satan is he who has the power of death, right? Same thing, right? Satan has the power of death. He's not death, but he has the power of death, according to Paul. So when he takes this into his realm, this power behind this humanity, right? It's almost like the humanity hid the divinity. And even still, the humanity of Christ hides the divinity. I mean, when you talk to most people, when they talk about Jesus, they don't think of him as the second person of the Godhead, the Logos. They think, oh, he was like a dude, man. Jesus was a good dude, man. He was a hippie. He was like a revolutionary, man. Jesus was a anarchist, man. Jesus was a good dude, like a prophet, man. No, they don't believe this, you see. That's the world's view. The world has a natural, almost naturally they think of Arianism or Nestorianism, right, when they think of Jesus. So this baits the devil. Devil takes him into his realm, Hades. But before we get to that, St. John Damascus says this is why the death of Christ destroys death and the power of Satan. Because this is divine life and power. He's taking it into his kingdom. Because of the power of divine life and power, it destroys his kingdom. He no longer has the keys to death and Hades, does he? Remember that verse? What did that verse mean? Who has the keys to death and Hades now? A man does. A God-man does, you see.
Meaning that what Adam lost as the steward of creation, he would have had the power of all reality under God as a steward. When he aligned with Satan, Adam put himself under Satan's dominion and was now subject to death. Mm-hmm. His head, his leader, so to speak, his God became Satan. And so what Christ does is that he comes into our nature, human nature, assumes it, undergoes death on the cross to go into Satan's realm, Satan's dimension, Satan's spiritual kingdom, destroy it from within, and now take back the power of the keys of death and hell and Hades that Satan had to give it back to human nature. That's the key here. Mm-hmm. So now human nature is not subject to death and the power of death that Satan introduced. It's now restored to what it was intended to be through the Edenic state, what God intended for Adam to have, right? That he lost. It's now restored, and now Christ, forever united to human nature, has the power over death and Hades.
So by taking this divine, deified body into Hades, this is why the descent is so important and why all the heretics don't even have the doctrine of the descent. By the descent, by Satan taking this bait down here in the realm of Hades, this life-giving power here not only destroys this place. Here's the Old Testament saints and patriarchs held, and they couldn't go to heaven yet because they were in a place called Abraham's bosom, but it still wasn't the heaven of heavens, right? So the realm of the dead, harrowing of hell, that's why we have this doctrine of the harrowing of hell.
Jesus says, God is not the God of the dead, but the God of the living, right? When he's debating with the Pharisees in the book of John, and he's talking about how Abraham is not dead, Abraham is alive. He's alive to God, right? Abraham's bosom. And so what happened is that in the process of Christ's ministry and then his death, burial, and resurrection, the Old Testament saints, we might say the fathers, the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they were in a place in Hades that was somewhat blessed, but still not the heavenly state, right? The third heavens that Paul talks about.
Why was that? Well, because human nature was fallen and it had not been restored yet, because the Messiah had not come and conquered death in the death, burial, and resurrection. So when Christ descended, and this is an important doctrine that's overlooked, especially in the West, is Christ's descent into hell, or quote Hades. This is just the abode of the dead. And he went there and preached the gospel. So presumably the pagans and others who had never heard of this coming Messiah would have then been exposed to him. And we don't know all the ins and outs of what went down, but we do know, and it is Orthodox doctrine, the harrowing of hell, that Christ took all of these patriarchs and he then led this ascension into the third heavens, or the throne of God, right? The heaven of heavens. Now, Hebrews says that the Old Testament, when the high priest would go into, and from the portico to the holy place into the Holy of Holies, that this was symbolic of Christ's ascension into heaven, right? And so in the Old Covenant, when the high priest would go in and he would sprinkle the blood of the covenant on the Day of Atonement on top of the ark, this was foreshadowing what would happen, or what would need to happen, for Christ to cleanse the way for humanity in these bodies that we have to be resurrected and then indwell and inhabit the heavens, right? And then at the end of time, we'll see that full universal bodily resurrection, right? And then the whole universe will be renovated and will become the abode of God, right? This was the symbolism of the Old Testament temple. It symbolized the entire universe in the first, second, and third heavens, okay? That's why there's 3 levels to the temple. This is what the book of Hebrews teaches if you read it. You couldn't go to heaven until Christ in his body had ascended into heaven, right? And made atonement in the heavenly tabernacle, right? Nobody could go there until that, the New Testament says. So when he went down there, he descended in his soul, his deified soul, into Hades, and that destroys the power of this realm. Imagine it like a virus being put into the system, like, at the end of the Matrix and Neo, like he becomes the virus to destroy the Matrix, right? That kind of a thing. But before we get to the descent, we want to make one last point that St. John makes about the fact that some of the heretics and historians and people, they would say, "Oh, but wait a minute! If his soul went to Hades, then there's 2 Christs, right?" And that's clever, sort of slippery there that they try to pull. But St. John of Damascus blows this away. He says, by the way, he says that this descent destroyed the power of the devil forever. Destruction comes to the destroyer, the death of death and the death of Christ. And so even though as man he died, as man Christ died, the divine person wasn't cut off from the Father. As man Christ died, his soul was separated from his immaculate body. However, the divinity was remained unseparated from both his soul and his body, because Christ is a divine person. And therefore he was never divided into 2 hypostases. He was never divided into 2 persons. Even at this death, he wasn't divided into 2 persons. For from the beginning, both had their existence in the same way in the person of the Word. And when they were separated from each other in death, body and soul, Christ's death, each one of them remained the possession of the one person of the Word, the Logos. Hence, the one person of the Word existed as person of the Word and soul of the body. For neither the soul nor the body ever had any personal existence of their own other than the eternal Logos. There was never 2 Christs, ever, even in the death and the descent. Hence, the person of Christ was always one, and it was always hypostatically united, even in the death. You see no place for the Protestant transaction theory. The Father damns the Son so that we could get this legal status of righteousness. None of that nonsense anywhere here, because all that nonsense requires Nestorian Christology. Then he goes into the corruption that Christ's body experiences in the tomb. That he didn't experience, right? Listen to this. The word destruction has two meanings. It means human suffering such as hunger, thirst, weariness, piercing with nails, his death, separation of the soul from the body, etc. In this sense, we can say that the Lord's body was destructible because he did endure all these things willingly. Destruction, however, also means the complete dissolution of the body in its reduction to the elements of which it was composed. By many, this is more generally called corruption. This the Lord's body did not experience, because David prophesied, "You will not leave my soul in Hades, nor will you give my body over to corruption." Right? Psalm 15:10. Therefore, it is impious to say with certain heretics like Julian and Gaius that the Lord's body before the resurrection was indestructible in the first sense. It was not. For it was thus incorruptible. If it was incorruptible in that sense, then it wasn't consubstantial with us. And the things that he underwent, such as hunger and thirst and nails and death, were phantasms. That is, of course, a mockery and a hoax, mocking of the crucifixion, and we do not possess salvation if that is the case. However, the Lord's body was indestructible in the first sense, in that he underwent certain things willingly, but that his body was not going to decompose. And through his body, the Lord granted the resurrection and consequent incorruptibility to our bodies, himself being the first fruits of the resurrection, and incorruptibility and impassibility. For corruptible must put on incorruption, says St. Paul. Therefore, the deified soul of Christ, when it went down into Hades, it was as if the Son of Justice had rose upon the earth. So he's quoting Malachi 4:2 about the descent into Hades, which is interesting because a lot of people wouldn't think of Malachi 4:2 as the descent, but it is. So that also the light might shine upon those who were under the earth, in Hades, in darkness and in the shadow of death. So that just as he had brought the good news of peace to those that were on earth, so also might he bring deliverance to the captives and sight to the blind and those that were under the earth. And thus the gospel was preached even to those in Hades. 1 Peter 3:19. You ever wonder why your Protestant churches never explain to you 1 Peter 3:19? This is one. He became a refutation of unbelief even to those that were in Hades. The gospel was preached in Hades, right here. All of those Old Testament people, many of those pagans presumably too, heard the gospel. That's why God wasn't unjust to all of these people that had died, who had never heard of Israel or the coming Messiah or whatever. Thus, having loosed all of those that had been bound for ages in Hades, he came back from the dead and made possible the resurrection. And after the resurrection from the dead, he put aside all human passions, such as hunger, thirst, sleep, fatigue, and the like. And although he did eat with his disciples, he did this because he wanted to, not because of need. And then he goes on to talk about the ascension. We see then, this is a very different doctrine from the Reformed nonsense doctrine of legal transactions and paying one person the Godhead pays the other, this infinite debt of all this garbage. No, this is much more sensible, and it makes sense with the Christology that we have. You see, the Christology then helps explain all of these other mysterious texts that Protestants and Calvinists, and nowadays even the Roman Catholics, pass over. They don't even have, what's the point of the descent? What was the point of the descent? Yeah, okay, so you recite it in the creed, but what was the purpose of it? Have you ever wondered, why did he descend into Hades? What was the point of that?
They don't have that concept. They don't even know what you're talking about when you talk about the descent into Hades and preaching. Why do you think Peter says he went into Hades to preach the gospel? Now, when I was Reformed, I could never make sense of that verse. I have no idea what Peter's talking about. He descended into Hades and preached the gospel to the dead? What? Well, if you're Orthodox, it makes perfect sense. Yeah. That's the descent into Hades. That's him preaching to the Old Testament patriarchs who were stored there, or perhaps, as Cyril says, to all of the dead who had no opportunity to hear the gospel. It's also another element that all of Latin theology has lost, which is the cosmic scope of Christ's redemption, recapitulation.
Right.
So it's not just a matter of moral salvation of individuals; it's a transformation of the whole universe, right? It's a purging even of the angelic realm. It's a salvation and purging of all of these realms to be restored to what it was the original Edenic intention. Jesus assumed universal human nature. This will be fundamental to Cyril's Christology, is that the only reason all men are resurrected, even the wicked, right? I remember as a Calvinist, I would always ponder, why are the reprobate resurrected? Because the only way to be resurrected is to have connection to Christ. Well, the reprobate have no connection to Christ. Why are they on what basis are they resurrected? Well, as you can see, it's a faulty Christology from the outset, right? The only way to be resurrected is to have Christ assuming that nature and raising it. Even the wicked are resurrected on the basis of Christ. Now, does that mean everybody's saved? No, it does not, because the way that you, as an individual hypostasis, act according to or against your nature, that will determine the salvation in the eschaton. Right? So everybody's going to the same place. Everybody's going to the same eschaton. But nature, even though Christ assumed universal human nature and restores universal human nature, it doesn't exist in the abstract. It only exists in the mode of hypostases, of persons. So you're a unique instantiation of human nature. I'm a unique instantiation of human nature. How we live in that mode, according to or against our nature, is what will determine the experience of the eschaton.
And just as you were saying, in regards to the descent into Hades, this is scriptural. So even though they talk about sola scriptura, it's like how do you get around some of this stuff? And
what does Jesus say? Just as Jonah was in the heart of the earth, so must the Son of Man descend to the was in the heart of the belly of the whale, so must the Son of Man descend into the heart of the earth.
Right. Right.
Paul says, how can he ascend if he did not first descend? So these are very kind of amazing, mind-blowing ideas that Orthodoxy teaches that have always been the case in the Church Fathers. They always exposit the descent into Hades in that way. And what does the Reformed tradition do? Reinterprets it all, makes it fit to their presuppositional scheme of soteriology, and says, the descent into Hades is Jesus being damned by the Father. It's ludicrous. Anyway, I'm just saying that Cyril and John Damascus have the same doctrine of the descent of Christ into Hades. So this is another really easy way to refute Calvinism, is to show the consistent Orthodox presentation of what happened at the death of Christ.